On this day in history, May 1st, 1169, Norman mercenaries land at Bannow Bay in Leinster, marking the beginning of the Norman invasion of Ireland. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Anglo-Norman invasion from 1166 to 1175. Early in his reign, 1155, Henry II of England had, through his envoy, John of Salisbury, received from Hadrian IV the grant of Ireland as an inheritance, on condition that he should reduce to order the Irish Church and State. The so-called Bull, Laudabilter, which defines this grant, rests on the sole authority of Giraldus Cambrensis. How far it is genuine is one of the puzzles of history, but the general submission of the Irish to Henry later would imply that some such papal privilege was in the air. Henry had to put his project aside for the time, and when the invasion came, it was a futile one and directed from South Wales, which was full of Norman adventurers. The first invaders, Maurice Fitzgerald, Robert Fitzstephen, Raymond Le Gros de Carew, and others were sons or grandsons of the famous Welsh princess Nesta, and vassals of Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, called Strongbow, in Irish tradition, Earl of Pembroke. Their opportunity came when Dermot MacMurrough, King of Leinster, expelled by his enemies, decided to seek aid in England and arrived in Bristol with his beautiful daughter Eva, Eof, in August 1166. He was there referred to Henry, found the king in France, was graciously received and given permission to raise forces in Britain. Returning to Wales, he won Fitzgilbert over by the offer of his daughter's hand with apparently the succession to Leinster. He also enlisted the sons of Nesta in his cause, and they found volunteers among the Welsh and Flemings of South Wales and Pembroke. Returning to Leinster, where his son Donald Kavanagh, whom Giraldus calls illegitimate, was holding out for him, he held his ground until successively Fitzgerald, Fitzstephen, Raymond, and finally Earl Richard himself arrived, the latter landing at Waterford in August 1170, with 200 knights and 1,000 men-at-arms. The successes of Dermot, backed by his professional fighters, were rapid. Danish Waterford was taken, the marriage of Eva and the Earl celebrated, and by a rapid march Dublin also was captured, and a relieving force under the High King scattered, late in 1170. Leinster and Ossory were reduced, but the death of Dermot the following May made the situation difficult. The Irish regarded his son Donald as the true heir, but Fitzgilbert considered himself King of Leinster, and anyway in feudal theory was, in virtue of his wife, lord of the province. But he was hemmed up in Dublin in midsummer by a national levy raised by Rory O'Connor, King of Connaught, and though this attack was repelled, it was uncertain whether he could hold his own. Therefore, when Henry, fearful lest a new Norman state should arise across the Irish Channel, resolved to come to Ireland, Strongbow placed his conquest at his suzerain's feet. Henry landed near Waterford on October 17, 1171, with an imposing army, but a conquest in arms was not necessary, and in fact the peaceful submission of the Irish leaders was prompt and widespread. The king marched to Lismore and Cashel, and finally to Dublin, where he spent the winter, leaving Ireland on April 27, 1172. Into this short period he packed the rough essentials of a government. At Dublin and elsewhere he received the homage of all kings of Ireland except those of Connaught and Ulster. To Strongbow he granted the land of Leinster, confirmed the Geraldines and others in their fiefs, and annexed to the crown the Danish kingdom of Dublin. He gave the capital to the men of Bristol, took the Ostmen under his protection, and appointed Hugh de Lacy governor of the colony. He did not scruple to confer on de Lacy the whole of Meath, though its native king, O'Melaghlin, had recently submitted, and the grant illustrates the inevitable clash of feudal and Irish law. Meanwhile, during the winter, the Irish bishops met at the Council of Cashel, and, after enacting various reforms, declared, according to Giraldus, divine offices shall be celebrated according to the forms of the Church of England, for it is just and right that Ireland has received her Lord and King from England. She should accept Reformation from the same source. This, of course, was an inspired assurance of the task with which the papacy had commissioned Henry. The submission of the Church was complete, nor was it a packed assembly. For though Christian, Bishop of Lismore, and Papal State, seems to have been on Henry's side, Lawrence, Archbishop of Dublin, and the native prelates of Cashel and Tuam were present. Thus was Ireland presented to the English crown as a papal fief. Such was the basis of its authority till 1541, and the Irish themselves accepted the fact. Meanwhile, the adventurers were attacking Desmond, though its king had submitted to Henry. De Lacy was organizing Meath, and John de Courcy conquered in Antrim, and Down, a principality for which he could show no royal patent. Strongbow enfeoffed Leinster deeply with Normans, giving for instance the barony of Naas to Maurice Fitzgerald. Strongbow died in 1176, leaving only a daughter, who later married William, the Earl of Marshall, and brought to him the land of Leinster. Ulster and Connaught were still unconquered, and in 1175, by the Treaty of Windsor, Henry acknowledged Rory O'Connor as the King of Connaught under him. On this day in history, May 2nd, 1194, King Richard I of England gives Portsmouth its first royal charter. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Portsmouth, a city, county, and parliamentary borough and seaport of Hampshire, England, 74 miles southwest from London, on the SR. Population, estimated from 1938, 258,400. Area, 14.4 square miles. The city suffered heavy air raids during World War II. About 93% of the houses were damaged, though many were repairable. But the Guildhall, 1890, both the main shopping centers and many public buildings were gutted. Portsmouth owes its origin to the retreat of the sea from Portchester. No town existed there until the 12th century, when its strategical advantage induced Richard I to build one. The borough is governed by a charter granted by Charles I in 1627, modified by the municipal acts of the 19th century. The market, dating from 1194, is held on Tuesday and Saturday. The naval station and arsenal is an aggregate of 4 towns, Portsmouth, Portsea, Landport, and Southsea, and occupies the southwestern part of Portsea Island, which lies between Portsmouth Harbour and Longstone Harbour, 2 inlets of the English Channel. Portsmouth Harbour opens into Spithead, one of the arms of the channel separating the Isle of Wight from the mainland. The harbour widens into bottle form, Portsmouth lying on the east shore of the Neck, with Gosport opposite to it on the west side. Portsmouth proper may be distinguished as the garrison town, Portsea as the naval station with the dockyards, Landport is occupied chiefly by the houses of artisans, and Southsea is a residential quarter and watering place. There is a modern Roman Catholic cathedral, the Church of St. Thomas of Canterbury. A cruciform building dates from about 1180. It was restored in 1904, and in 1935 a scheme of enlargement was begun. In 1924, the foundation of a new diocese of Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight, taken from that of Winchester, was approved, and St. Thomas's was designated as the pro-cathedral. The see was created in 1927. The garrison chapel originally belonged to the Hospital of St. Nicholas, a foundation of the 13th century. Passenger steamers from Portsmouth Harbour ride in the Isle of Wight. A ferry and a floating bridge connect with Gosport. The parliamentary borough was divided into central, north, and south divisions in 1918, each returning 1 member. The county borough was created in 1888 and raised to the dignity of a city, 1926, with a Lord Mayor in 1928. Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, on which he met his death at Trafalgar in 1805, is in dry dock in Portsmouth. She is the flagship of the Admiral of the station. The dockyard dates in its earliest form from 1496, though the town was already of importance as a naval station. Its later rise began with the building of 1 dry and 2 wet docks in 1698. In 1848, a steam basin of 4 new docks were opened, the dockyard ground being extended to 115 acres. In 1865, extensive works decided upon included a tidal basin and a deep dock and 2 locks, in themselves serving as large docks, which lead to 3 basins and 4 docks. Subsequent improvements included 2 new dry docks, 1896, the construction of jetties at the entrance to the tidal basin and at the north wall, the establishment of a coal wharf with hydraulic appliances, numerous subsidiary works, and extensive dredging of the harbor to increase the berthing accommodation for the fleet. New locks and a dry dock were completed shortly before World War I. In 1925, the government decided to reduce the dockyards at Rosyth and Pembroke to a care and maintenance basis and to concentrate all Admiralty home dock work at Portsmouth, Devonport, Chatham, and Sheerness. Portsmouth Royal Dockyards cover an area of 500 acres. There is a gunnery establishment on Whale Island and barracks, including those of the Royal Marine Artillery at Eastney, beyond Southsea. On this day in history, May 3, 1802, Washington, D.C. is incorporated as a city after Congress abolishes the Board of Commissioners, the district's founding government. The city of Washington is given a mayor-council form of government. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the government of the city. Washington is the seat of the U.S. federal government, and as such is not self-ruled, but governed by the federal Congress. The city was chartered in 1802 with a mayor appointed annually by the president and an elective council of 2 chambers. The mayor was elected by the council from 1812 to 1820, and by the people biennially from 1820 to 1871. In 1871, the Federal Congress repealed the charters of Washington and Georgetown and established a new government for the entire district, consisting of a governor, secretary, board of public works, board of health, and a council appointed by the president with the concurrence of the Senate, and a House of Delegates and an elected delegate to the National House of Representatives. In 1874, Congress substituted a government by 3 commissioners appointed by the president with the concurrence of the Senate, and in 1878 the government by commissioners was made permanent. 2 of the commissioners must be residents of the district, and the 3rd must be an officer of the Corps of Engineers of the U.S. Army. The district commissioners are the chief executive officers. The federal Congress legislates for the district. The president, the commissioners, and the Supreme Court of the district appoint the administrative officers and boards, and the president appoints the judges of the district courts, viz., a court of appeals, Supreme Court, municipal court, police, probate court, and juvenile court. The revenue of the district, which is derived from real estate, income, and personal property taxes, and from licenses, is paid into the U.S. Treasury. Appropriations, always specific and based on estimates prepared by the commissioners, are made only by Congress, and all accounts are audited by the Treasury Department. The federal government owns the waterworks, by which an abundant supply of water is taken from the Potomac at the Great Falls, conducted for 10 miles through 2 aqueducts, and filtered through 2 sand filtration plants. On this day in history, March 4th, 1471, as part of the Wars of the Roses, and during the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward IV defeats a Lancastrian army and kills Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The battle fought on May 3, 1471, closed the long conflict in England of the War of the Roses. The Yorkish victory at Barnet, less than 3 weeks before, marked the ruin of the Lancastrian cause. Tewkesbury was a last desperate venture. Contrary winds had delayed the passage from France of Queen Margaret, wife of the imprisoned King Henry VI, and with a small body of Lancastrian supporters, she landed in the west of England on the day of the disaster at Barnet. With her was her young son, Edward, Prince of Wales. The Duke of Somerset and other survivors of the defeated army a few days later joined her standard. Margaret wished to return to France, but was persuaded that the Lancastrian strength in the west was unbroken. Adherents were recruited from Devon and Somerset as Margaret struck inland towards the Welsh border, hoping to join forces with Jasper Tudor. Edward IV, at Windsor, gathered an army and moved westwards to intercept the invaders, who, after forced marches, found the city of Gloucester hostile and its gates closed against them. They struggled on to Tewkesbury, utterly exhausted. King Edward arrived the same evening. Somerset, commanding the Queen's forces, accepted battle next morning. The position chosen was a strong one, on the gentle slope where the broad Severn flows through the valley. It was much cut up by dikes and hedges, and declivities, through which small watercourses passed, protected both flanks. The town and the river were at the rear. As at Barnet, each opposing army was drawn up in 3 divisions, Edward commanding the Yorkist centre, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and Lord Hastings, the 2 wings. Little impression was made by Edward's attack, till Somerset, whose ranks were being depleted by the fire of the Yorkist artillery and archers, led the Lancasterian right in an impetuous charge on the king's line. It was not supported. Lord Wenlock and the Earl of Devon, with the Lancasterian centre and the left divisions, kept their ground. The charge failed, and Somerset was driven back with heavy loss. He suspected treachery, and in the subsequent rout was said to have cleft the skull of Lord Wenlock with his battle-axe for not taking part in the charge. Pursuing their advantage in the confusion, the Yorkists broke into the Lancasterian main position, forcing their enemy back to the town and Severn banks, where great slaughter ensued. A riverside field to this day bears the name of Bloody Meadow. Edward, Prince of Wales, was slain when crying for mercy. The Earl of Devon and other nobles perished. Somerset himself, with Longstrother the treasurer, and many fugitives gained sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey, from which they were forcibly taken, and after summary trial were executed. Next day, Queen Margaret, who had fled into a neighbouring convent, was made prisoner. On the night of Edward IV's return from the victory, King Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London. The death of Edward, Prince of Wales, on the battlefield left the English throne with no direct heir in the Lancasterian line. On this day in history, May 5th, 553, the Second Council of Constantinople begins. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the council. The Council of 553, the fifth ecumenical, acknowledged to be so in 680, grew out of the controversy of the 3 chapters. It was utterly subservient to the emperor. The 3 chapters were condemned and their authors long dead, anathematized, without, however, derogating from the authority of the Council of Chalcedon, which had given them a clean bill of orthodoxy. The Orthodox faith was set forth in 14 anathemas, with special reference to Nestorians. Opinion is still divided as to whether Origen was condemned. His name occurs in the 11th anathema, but some consider it an interpolation. Hefele defends the genuineness of the text, but finds no evidence for a special session against Origen, as some have conjectured. A small council was held in Constantinople in 543, to which the anathemas against Origen probably belong. On this day in history, May 6, 1682, Louis XIV of France moves his court to the Palace of Versailles. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the palace. Louis XIII often hunted in the woods of Versailles, and built a small pavilion at the corner of what is now the Rue de la Pompe and the Avenue of St. Cloud. In 1627 he entrusted Jacques Le Mercier with the plans of a chateau. In 1661, Louis le Vieux made some additions which were further developed by him in 1668. In 1678, Monsart took over the work, the Galerie des Glaces, the chapel, and the 2 wings being due to him. In 1682, Louis XIV took up his residence in the chateau. Till his time, the town was represented by a few houses to the south of the present Place des Armes. The land was given to the lords of the court, and new houses sprung up, chiefly in the north quarter. Under Louis XV, the parish of St. Louis was formed to the south for the increasing population, and new streets were built to the north on the meadows of Clagny. Under Louis XVI, the town extended to the east and received a municipality. In 1802, it gave its name to a bishopric. In 1783, the armistice preliminary to the Treaty of Peace between Great Britain and the United States was signed at Versailles. The States General met here on the 5th of May, 1789, and on the 20th of June took the solemn oath in the tennis court, by which they bound themselves not to separate till they had given France a constitution. Napoleon neglected, and Louis XVIII and Charles X merely kept up. Versailles, but Louis Philippe made great alterations, some of which were later altered back to the original designs, partly with the help of a large gift from the USA. In 1870 and 1871, the town was the headquarters of the German army besieging Paris, and in the Galerie des Glaces, William I of Prussia was crowned German Emperor in 1871. after the Peace of Versailles was the seat of the French National Assembly, while the Commune was triumphant in Paris, and of the two chambers till 1879 being declared the official capital of France. After World War I, the treaty between the Allied powers and Germany was signed in the Galerie des Glaces. During World War II, Versailles was occupied by the Germans at the same time as Paris, June 1940. On this day in history, May 7th, 1274, in France, the Second Council of Lyon opens. It ratified a decree to regulate the election of the Pope. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Councils of Lyon. The First Council of Lyon met at the summons of Pope Innocent IV in June and July of 1245 to deliberate on the conflict between Church and the Emperor, of the assistance to be granted to the Holy Land and the Eastern Empire, on measures of protection against the Tartars, and on the suppression of heresy. Among these tasks, the most important in the eyes of the Pope was that the Council should lend him effectual aid in his labors to overthrow the Emperor Friedrich II. The condemnation of the emperor was a foregone conclusion, and the objections of the emperor's representative, Thaddeus of Susa, that the accused had not been regularly cited, that the pope was plaintiff and judge in one, and that therefore the whole process was anomalous, achieved a little success, as his appeal to the future pontiff and to a truly ecumenical council. On July 17th, the verdict was pronounced by Innocent IV, excommunicating Friedrich and dethroning him on the grounds of perjury, sacrilege, heresy, and felony. All oaths of fealty sworn to him were pronounced null and void, and the German princes were commanded to proceed with the election of a new sovereign. The Second Council of Lyon met from May 7th to July 17th, 1274, under the presidency of Gregory X. Its chief result was the regulation that future elections to the papacy should be held by the College of Cardinals in conclave. It is also important through the appearance of representatives of the Eastern Emperor Michael VIII, who acknowledged the supremacy of the Pope over the Eastern Church. On this day in history, May 8th, 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny is drafted between King Edward III of England and King John II of France, also known as the Good. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the village. Bretigny, French hamlet, department of Eure-et-Loir, arrondissement and canton of Chartres, commune of Sours, which gave its name of a treaty concluded there on May 8, 1360, between Edward III of England and John II of France. Edward III obtained, besides Guienne and Gascony, Poitou, Saint-Yon, and Aunis, Argien, Périgord, Limousin, Quercy, Bigorre, the courtship of Guerre, Angoulême, Rouerre, Montreuil-sur-Mer, Ponthieu, Calais, Sanguet, Ham, and the courtship of Guienne. John II had moreover to pay 3 million gold crowns for his ransom. On his side, the King of England gave up the duchies of Normandy and Touraine, the courtships of Anjou and Maine, and the suzerainty of Brittany and of Flanders. The treaty should more properly be called the Treaty of Calais, since it was ratified there on October 24th, when an important clause in the Treaty of Bretigny was omitted. On this day in history, May 9th, 328, Athanasius is elected Patriarch of Alexandria. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the saint. Athanasius the Great, saint and bishop of Alexandria, was born about 298, probably at Alexandria. He received a liberal education. From early years he was instructed in the scriptures, that is, the Septuagint and New Testament. He knew no Hebrew. These studies, combined with Greek learning, molded his later thought. In mind and outlook, he was a thorough Greek. There was nothing of the native Egyptian about him. As a lad, he attracted the attention of the bishop Alexander, and was taken into his household. At some period, he also came under the influence of St. Antony. His first literary work, comprising the Contra Gentes and De Incarnatione Verbi, 2 parts of what is really one treatise, may be dated with tolerable certainty about 318, since it is entirely silent on the Arian controversy. It is an amazing production for a youth barely out of his teens. It shows more of the influence of Origen and Alexandrian thought than his later works, but in asserting man's need of redemption and the meeting of that need through the Incarnation, establishes once and for all the gospel for which he battled throughout his life. Alexander had inherited from his predecessor the disorders caused by the schismatic ordinations of Meletius, bishop of Lycopolis, who had intruded himself during the persecution into the diocese. To these in 319 were added the dissensions caused by the teaching of Arius. Arius taught that the Son of God was a created being. There was a time when he did not exist. He was indeed the firstborn of all creations and surpassed them in dignity. Through him, all other creatures were made, but he could only be called divine in a limited and secondary sense. Arius also denied the full humanity of Christ. He held that this semi-divine being only took a body through which he acted. The Council of Nicaea were forced to employ some technical term, not in Scripture, to rule out such teaching, which contradicted the sense of Scripture. Thus they added to the creed the test word homoousios, that is, one of essence or substance. There is nothing materialistic about it in Greek. All that it asserts is that whatever the essential being of God is, namely divinity, the Father and the Son possess it equally. They also affirm that the Son was one of ousia, or essential being, of the Father. That is, he was not created out of nothing. He existed eternally. The question of the full humanity of Christ came into full prominence only at a later stage. In 321, Alexander sent out his first encyclical letter defending the deposition of Arius by an Egyptian synod. In this, it is reasonable to trace the hand of Athanasius, now a deacon and the bishop's secretary. As such, he accompanied Alexander to Nicaea. He states that he himself spoke in the council, perhaps at unofficial debates, but we must not assign to him too large a part in the proceedings. As a deacon, he was not a member of the council, but his influence was such that the Arians soon came to recognize in him their most formidable antagonist. Alexander returned to his see, and 5 months after concluding negotiations with the Meletians, died. He had nominated Athanasius as his successor. In June 328, he was canonically elected, in spite of opposition from Meletians and Arians. The cry of the people, "Give us Athanasius, the good one of the ascetics," attest his popularity. For 7 years he occupied his see, devoting himself to the work of his diocese and visiting the monks in the desert. He was rewarded by the solid loyalty shown to him in his later troubles. Meanwhile, the reaction against Nicaea was being fostered. It was assisted by Constantine's attempt to enforce unity by persecution, against which Athanasius protested. The policy of Eusebius of Nicomedia was to attack first the Nicene leaders. Eustathius of Antioch and others were deposed on various charges. Troubles were stirred up in Egypt. Meletians were encouraged to make common cause with the Arians. Athanasius himself was embroiled with the emperor by refusing to admit Arius to communion. A whole series of charges were brought against him, which he had no difficulty in refuting at an audience with Constantine. But the attack was not abandoned. Constantine forced him to attend a synod at Tyre in 335, which was resolved to condemn him. A commission was sent to Egypt to collect more evidence. Meanwhile, Athanasius fled and appealed to Constantine in person. The synod deposed him, but Constantine summoned the leaders to court. A new charge was now preferred, that he had threatened to stop the export of corn from Alexandria to Constantinople. Possibly the emperor feared his great influence. If so, it must have been due to his dominating personality. The Patriarch of Alexandria had not yet had time to acquire the political importance that he later enjoyed, though the development of this was doubtless forwarded by the prominence of Athanasius. More probably, the emperor regarded him as an intransigent and as an obstacle to that peace in the church and state on which his heart was set. He was banished unheard to Trier. Constantine died a year and a half later. At once Athanasius returned, ignoring, perhaps unwisely, the sentence of deposition passed at Tyre. This gave his enemies excuse for declaring the see vacant and filling it with an Arianizer. Of the sons of Constantine, Constantine II and Constans were on the side of the Nicenes. Constantius, to whom was allotted the East, was an Arianizer. After several efforts, the enemies of Athanasius succeeded in installing an Arian Gregory in the See of Alexandria by force of arms, with the consent of Constantius. Athanasius fled to Rome, where in the autumn of 340 Pope Julius held a council of Western bishops, which acquitted him. He followed it by a sharp remonstrance to the bishops of the East. In spite of this, at the Dedication Council of Antioch in 341, the deposition of Athanasius was confirmed. The council marks a change of policy. Not only are the Nicene leaders to be attacked, but an effort is to be made to find new and vaguer formulary to be substituted for that of Nicaea. In 343, a new general council was held at Sardica, at the instigation of Constans. Constantius was too embarrassed by the Persian Wars to refuse. Athanasius was vindicated, but the general result was only by emphasizing religious differences to deepen the political breach between East and West. In 346, Constans compelled his brother Constantius to act on the decision and restore Athanasius. So began the Golden Decade of his episcopal rule, but the East was still critical of Nicaea. In 350, Constans was murdered by the troops of the usurper Magnentius, who sent officers to seek the support of Athanasius, a singular proof of his influence in Egypt. Athanasius refused to entertain such overtures, but they formed a ground of accusation against him after the defeat of Magnentius by Constantius. When in 351 Constantius became sole emperor, the Arianizers had their chance. A council at Sirmium issued a new creed, orthodox as far as it went, but in practical effect anti-Nicene. Under pressure from Constantius, the West was compelled to condemn Athanasius. Synods at Arles in 353 and Milan in 355 were forced by the most violent methods to consent to his deposition. This was clinched by the exile of his friends, including Pope Liberius. Finally, in 356, he himself was attacked by imperial troops, but escaped to the desert. For 6 years he was lost to sight, but his influence was never greater. He produced a stream of anti-Arian writings, including the 3 orations against the Arians. He watched the anti-Nicene party fall to pieces in the hour of its triumph. At the one extreme were the Onomoians, so called because they taught that the Son was unlike the Father. This teaching was only the honest assertion of what Arius had really believed. In the middle came the Homoians, who wished by using the vague phrase that the Son was like the Father to evade the real issue and include as many as possible in a state church. They were preeminently the court party, who were content to subordinate religion to the requirements of the state. At the other end were the so-called Semi-Arians, whose formula was homoi osios, of like essence or substance. They were for the most part really orthodox, but had scruples about the Nicene of one substance. It must be admitted the Nicene word was of dubious means. The term oisa might mean either a particular entity or the common element shared by a class of particulars. Thus, to say that the Son was of one oisa with the Father might be held to mean that they were both only modes or aspects of the one God, a heresy which is technically called Sabellianism, after Sabellius, who taught it. It is probable that the heretic Paul of Samosata had used the term to assert that God was unipersonal and that the term itself had been condemned in this sense. Marcellus of Ancyra, the ally of Athanasius, used it in his teachings that the Logos had no eternal personal existence. It is true that in the Creed of Nicaea, the distinct existence of Son was guarded by the further phrase of the essence of the Father, but the hesitations of the more old-fashioned theologians of the school of Origen can be explained. The weakness of the phrase homoi oisos was that it was equally unscriptural, and did not by itself safeguard the full divinity of the Son, but Athanasius was prepared to accept it as an alternative, with certain additions to strengthen it, and to show that it meant more than that the Son was vaguely like the Father. The popular idea that the controversy between Catholics and Arians was simply over a diphthong ignores the complexity of the problem and the variety of shades of opinion. Athanasius grasped the situation. The semi-Arians received a shock by a creed put out by the Anomoeans at Sirmium in 357, commonly called the blasphemy. They were outmaneuvered by the Homoeans at the synods of Arminium and Seleucia in 359. Then Athanasius produced his De Synodis, exposing the hollowness of the Homoean position and appealing to the semi-Arians to support the Homoousian as the one safeguard against Arianism. Though the appeal failed at the moment, it bore fruit later. Constantius died in 361. Julian recalled the exiles. Athanasius was able to return for 8 months. He used his time well. In 362, he summoned a council at Alexandria, which had results out of all proportion to its size and advanced the cause of reunion with the semi-Arians. As we saw, the term ousia was ambiguous. It might mean either a particular being or a common essence. The same ambiguity belonged to the term hypostasis, though it inclined to the meaning of a particular entity. In the anathemas appended to the Creed of Nicaea, ousia and hypostasis were employed as synonyms. This increased the suspicion of the East that the term homoousios really excluded any real distinctions in the Godhead. On the other hand, writers who used the term hypostasis in the sense of person to mark the distinctions in the Godhead seemed to those who used it in the other sense to be speaking of 3 gods. Athanasius saw that the dispute was at bottom a matter of the use of terms. In the important Tomos ad Antiochenos, which records the decisions of the council, both uses of hypostasis were recognized and explained, and the term homoousios was cleared of ambiguity. The way was prepared for the acceptance of the later terminology, 1 ousia, 3 hypostases, corresponding to the Western 1 substance, 3 persons. Julian was acute enough to see in Athanasius the foremost representative of the religion that he hated. He singled him out for persecution, and, in spite of the protests of his flock, forced him to take refuge in the desert. On the accession of Jovian in 363, who treated him with great honor, he returned. But when Valens became emperor of the East in 364 and revived the policy of Constantius, Athanasius was again compelled to withdraw for his 5th exile. After a few months, Valens restored him, and for the remaining 7 years of his life he was left undisturbed. The welfare of the empire demanded peace in Egypt, and peace in Egypt demanded the presence of Athanasius. Outside Egypt, Valens was persecuting semi-Arians and Nicaeans alike. The policy of Athanasius was succeeding. The majority of the semi-Arians were adopting the formula of Nicaea. Athanasius died in 373 before his cause had conquered. When Valens died in 378, Arianism fell, and the cause for which Athanasius had fought proved triumphant. Athanasius was one of the greatest characters in early church history. He was, in the best sense of the term, a great ecclesiastic. His aim in life was the highest welfare of the church. Thus we see him the first of the great protagonists of spiritual liberty against the encroachments of the state. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was no Byzantine. He was a free Greek, with the Greek's loyalty to truth at all costs. Though he had the courage of a martyr, he never courted martyrdom. But under the new conditions that followed the so-called conversion of Constantine, he discerned the peril that threatened the life of the church, and was prepared to defend its spiritual independence even at the cost of his own life, against the state that threatened to stifle it by its embrace, as it had formerly threatened to destroy it by persecution. In the administration of his diocese, he won the loyalty of his flock. Though his exegetical writings have almost entirely perished, his letters show the true pastoral spirit. His return from exile was followed by a conspicuous revival both of religion and morality. Nor is our estimate of his character seriously shaken by the papyri recently discovered, one of them a possible autograph of Athanasius. Several of them came from a Meletian source, and represent him as instigating outrages by the mobs of Meletians, and as tyrannical, shifty, and nervous about his own safety. Those familiar with religious partisan literature will discount much of their animosity. At most, they show that Athanasius in his earlier years was at times hard and impatient to his opponents, and it was the fault natural to his character, and he had much provocation. And after all, he may well have felt that it was a bishop's duty to put down false doctrine and disorder. From the religious point of view, his supreme achievement was that by his unflinching constancy to the truth, combined with his willingness to tolerate a variety of expression, by his personal holiness and devotion, he saved Christianity from compromising its assertion of the two fundamental truths of the unity of God and the divinity of Christ. Arianism was but the working out of its logical conclusion of the tendency of much earlier theology to regard the pre-existent Logos as a separate being side by side with the Father, a second and a secondary God. That was polytheism. It is the great strength of Athanasius that he was never the mere theologian. His earliest work, the De Incarnatione, showed that he had grasped the truth that lies at the heart of the gospel, that man needs redemption. He is not only weak and ignorant, but rebellious. His formal theology in this work may be vague and confused. For the moment, he is concerned with an apology for the Christian faith as a whole, not with its details. The Incarnation meets man's deepest needs because it brings not only illumination, but redemption. Only power from outside could deliver him from sin and death. His refusal to accept the Arian Christ rested on the conviction that one who was not fully God could neither reveal God nor impart divine life. To worship the Arian Christ would be idolatry. If at Nicaea he supported the homoousios, it was because there was no other phrase that ruled out the speculations that undermined the truth of redemption. Speaking generally, he has a claim to be placed in the first rank of the great religious reformers because he recalled Christianity from the barren paths of speculation into which it had strayed since the time of Origen, to a new sense of the reality of the gospel. There was a danger that the Church might have degenerated into a mere philosophical sect. The Logos doctrine was for him not merely an explanation of the order of the universe, but a principle of salvation. He placed at the center of Christian life the idea of Christ as eternal Son rather than eternal Word. There is a new awareness in his writings of the underlying hostility between the world and the Church. No one has suffered more than Athanasius by being judged from collections of dogmatic utterances divorced from their context, such as are found in histories of dogma. They can only be rightly studied in the conjunction with his pastoral and aesthetic writings. At the same time, it is wrong to depreciate Athanasius as a thinker. He is rightly styled the father of Greek orthodoxy. In his works, though they are all, in the strictest sense of the term, occasional writings, we find laid down the lines on which later orthodoxy developed. If his theology lacks the precision and refinement of later Greek thought, it is at least open to discussion whether this may not, in many cases, be a merit rather than a defect. The so-called Athanasian Creed is universally admitted to be later than the time of Athanasius. Much discussion has centered round his use of homoousios. In spite of his loyalty to Nicaea, he very rarely employs it in his own earlier writings. After his visit to Rome, he is less shy of it. We saw the ambiguity of the term resulting from its use in pagan philosophy. The precise meaning that he attached to it can only be gained by a study of his writings. He explicitly disclaims any philosophical use of it. His interest is in the religion of the plain man. The Son is as divine as the Father, and therefore can be worshipped without idolatry and bestow divine life, because it is his to bestow. He was hampered by the fact that he possessed no term to express the distinction of the persons, though he did more than anyone else to fix the later terminology. Yet it is doubtful if the phrase three hypostases ever occurred in his own writings. His final service to the later theology of the Trinity was that when the question of the divinity of the Holy Spirit emerged towards the close of the Arian controversy, he asserted that the Holy Spirit was homoousios with the Father and the Son, and based his assertion on similar grounds. The Spirit could not sanctify unless he were fully and truly divine. In this teaching, he anticipates later theology. So too in Christianity, Athanasius is the precursor of later Greek thought. The accusation that he was an Apollinarian has recently been brought against him. It is true that in his earlier writings he uses language that, if it is pressed, might be taken to support Apollinarianism. But he is not using it in any technical sense. It is indeed doubtful against whom his letter to Epictetus and his language in the De Synodus is directed, but his statements make plain that when teaching was brought to his notice that denied the possession of a human mind and a soul by Christ, he immediately resisted it with vigor. It is true that he never worked out a theology of the person of Christ, and that his interest was centered round his divinity rather than his humanity, but his writings were often quoted in later controversy, and are in full accord with the theology of Chalcedon. Lastly, in the history of Christian monasticism, Athanasius holds an important place. In the East, as contrasted with the West, monasticism developed in independence of ecclesiastical organization. Its attitude to the Church was in large part that of detachment. Hence, it is conceivable that in Egypt a schism might have arisen. Hence, the friendship of Athanasius with Antony and Pachomius, and his reputation for asceticism were of practical importance. He was the first episcopal promoter of monasticism, and was rewarded by the unfailing support of the monks in all his difficulties. He enabled the ascetic spirit to find a home in the Catholic Church. Further, his visit to Rome had an important effect on Western monasticism. Monasteries of some kind existed in Italy, but his arrival gave the first great impulse to monastic life. His Life of St. Antony is addressed to the Western monks and had great influence. It is by no means accidental that the champion of the faith of Nicaea should also be the patron of monasticism. He was the enemy of pagan compromise in Christian life, no less than in Christian belief. On this day in history, May 10th, 1503, Christopher Columbus visits the Cayman Islands and names them Las Tortugas after the numerous turtles there. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the islands. Cayman Islands, 3 low-lying islands in the West Indies, Grand Cayman, Little Cayman, and Cayman Brac, are situated between 79 degrees 44 minutes and 80 degrees 26 minutes west, and 19 degrees 44 minutes and 19 degrees 46 minutes north, forming a dependency of Jamaica, which lies 178 miles east by southeast. Grand Cayman, a flat rock-bound island protected by coral reefs, is 17 miles long, and varies from 4 miles to 7 miles in breadth. It has 2 towns, Georgetown and Bowdointown. Little Cayman and Cayman Brac are both about 70 miles, east by northeast of Grand Cayman. The soil is shallow but not infertile. Some small mahogany and other timber and dyewoods are grown. Large quantities of coconuts are produced in the smaller islands. Phosphate deposits are worked, but the most lucrative occupation is catching turtles for export to Jamaica. The white people are of fine physique and excellent shipwrights, and do trade in schooners built locally. The government is administered by a commissioner, and the laws passed by the local legislature are subject to the assent of the governor of Jamaica. Population, estimated from 1938, 6,850. The islands were discovered by Columbus, who named them Tortugas, from the turtles with which the surrounding seas abound. They were never occupied by the Spaniards and were colonized from Jamaica by the British. On this day in history, May 11th, 330, Constantine the Great dedicates the much expanded and rebuilt city of Byzantium, changing its name to New Rome and declaring it the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Byzantium and featuring narration from my friend, Ungulus.
Byzantium, a Greek city on the shores of the Bosphorus, occupying the most easterly of the 7 hills of modern Constantinople. It was founded by the Megarians and the Argives under Byzas, about 657 BC, but destroyed in the reign of Darius Hystaspes by the satrap Otanes, and it was recolonized by the Spartan Pausanians, 479 BC. Its situation was remarkable for beauty and security. It controlled the Euxine grain trade. The depths of its harbor rendered its quays accessible to vessels of large burden, while the fisheries were so lucrative that the curved inlet near which it stood became known as the Golden Horn. The population was partly Lacedaemonian and partly Athenian. It was thus a subject of dispute between these states, and was alternately in possession of each, till it fell to the hands of the Macedonians. About 7 years after its second colonization, the Athenian Cimon wrested it from the Lacedaemonians, but in 440 BC it returned to its former allegiance. Alcibiades, after a severe blockade, 408 BC, gained possession of the city through treachery of the Athenian party. In 405 BC, it was retaken by Lysander and placed under a Spartan harmist. It was under the Lacedaemonians when the 10,000, exasperated by the conduct of the governor, made themselves masters of the city, and would have pillaged it but for the eloquence of Xenophon. In 390 BC, Thrasybulus expelled the Lacedaemonian oligarchy and restored democracy and the Athenian influence. Byzantium joined with Rhodes, Chios, Kos, and Mausolus, king of Caria, in throwing off the yoke of Athens, but sought Athenian assistance when Philip of Macedon advanced against it. The Athenians under Chares suffered a severe defeat from Amyntas, the Macedonian admiral, but in the following year gained a decisive victory under Phocion, and compelled Philip to raise the siege. The deliverance of the besieged from a surprise by means of a flash of light which revealed the advancing Macedonian army has rendered this siege memorable. As a memorial of the miraculous interference, the Byzantines erected an altar to the torch-bearing Hecate and stamped a crescent on their coins, a device which is retained by the Turks to this day. During the reign of Alexander, Byzantium was compelled to acknowledge the Macedonian supremacy. After the decay of the Macedonian power, it regained its independence, but suffered from the incursions of the Scythians. The losses which they sustained by land roused the Byzantines to indemnify themselves from the vessels which crowded the harbor and the merchantmen which cleared the straits, but this had the effect of provoking a war with the neighboring naval powers. The exchequer being drained to buy off the Gauls about 279 BC, and the imposition of an annual tribute of 80 talents, they were compelled to exact a toll on all the ships that passed the Bosphorus, a measure which the Rhodians avenged by a war wherein the Byzantines were defeated. During the first years of its alliance with Rome, Byzantium held the rank of a free confederate city, but having sought arbitration on some of its domestic disputes, it was subjected to imperial jurisdiction, and gradually stripped of its privileges. The Emperor Claudius remitted the heavy tribute which had been imposed upon it, but the last remnant of its independence was taken away by Vespasian, who taunted the inhabitants with having forgotten to be free. The city was besieged and taken, 196 AD, by Severus, who destroyed it, demolished the famous wall, and put the principal inhabitants to the sword. The overthrow of Byzantium was a great loss to the empire, since it might have served as a protection against the Goths, who afterwards sailed past it into the Mediterranean. Severus afterwards relented, and, rebuilding a large portion of the town, gave it the name of Augusta Antonina. It had scarcely begun to recover its former position when, through the capricious resentment of Gallienus, the inhabitants were once more put to the sword, and the town was pillaged. From this disaster the inhabitants recovered so far as to be able to give an effectual check to an invasion of the Goths in the reign of Claudius II, and the fortifications were strengthened during the civil wars which followed the abdication of Diocletian. Diocletian had resolved to transfer his capital to Nicodemia, but Constantine, struck with the advantages which the situation of Byzantium presented, resolved to build a new city there on the site of the old, and transfer the seat of government to it 330 AD.
On this day in history, May 12, 254, Pope Stephen I succeeds Pope Lucius I, becoming the 23rd Pope of the Catholic Church, and immediately takes a stand against Novatianism. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Pope Stephen I. Stephen I, Bishop of Rome from about 254 to 257, followed Lucius I. He withdrew from church fellowship with Cyprian and certain Asiatic bishops on account of their views as to the necessity of the rebaptizing of heretics. He is also mentioned as having insisted on the restoration of the bishops of Meridia and Astorga, who had been deposed from unfaithfulness during persecution, but afterwards had repented. He is commemorated on August 2nd. His successor was Sextus II. On this day in history, May 13th, 1619, Dutch statesman Johan van Oldenbarnevelt is executed in The Hague after being convicted of treason. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Van Oldenbarnevelt's religious differences and the sequel. The now free and independent state was rent by internal differences between the Remonstrants, Arminians, and Contra-Remonstrants, Gomarists. The states of Holland, under the influence of Oldenbarnevelt, supported the former and refused to sanction the summoning of a purely church synod, 1613. They likewise, 1614, forbade the preachers in the province of Holland to treat of disputed subjects from their pulpits. Obedience was difficult to enforce without military help. Riots broke out in certain towns, and when Maurice was appealed to as captain general, he declined to act. He did more, though in no sense a theologian. He declared himself on the side of the Contra-Remonstrants, and established a preacher of that persuasion in the church at The Hague, 1617. The advocate now took a bold step. He proposed that the states of Holland should, on their own authority, as a sovereign province, raise a local force of 4,000 men, Voordgelders, to keep the peace. The States Generals, meanwhile, by a bare majority, 4 provinces to 3, agreed to the summoning of a national church synod. The states of Holland, also by a narrow majority, refused their assent to this, and passed, August 4th, 1617, a strong resolution, Scherpe Resoluti, by which all magistrates, officials, and soldiers in the pay of the province were required to take an oath of obedience to the states on pain of dismissal, and were to be held accountable not to the ordinary tribunals, but to the states of Holland. It was a declaration of sovereign independence on the part of Holland, and the States General took up the challenge and determined on decisive action. A commission was appointed, with Maurice at its head, to compel the disbanding of the Voordgelders. On July 31st, 1618, the stadtholder appeared at Utrecht, which had thrown in its lot with Holland, at the head of a body of troops, and at his command the local levies at once laid down their arms. His progress through the towns of Holland met with him no opposition. The states party was crushed without a blow being struck. On August 23rd, by order of the States General, the advocate and his chief supporters, De Groot and Hoogerbeets, were arrested. Oldenbarnevelt was with his friends kept in the strictest confinement until November, and then brought for examination before a commission appointed by the States General. He appeared more than 60 times before the commissioners, and was, most unjustly, allowed neither to consult papers nor to put his defense in writing. On February 20th, 1619, he was arraigned before a special court of 24 members, only half of whom were Hollanders, and nearly all of them his personal enemies. It was in no sense a legal court, nor had it any jurisdiction over the prisoner, but the protest of the advocate, who claimed his right to be tried by the sovereign province of Holland, whose servant he was disregarded. He was allowed no advocates, nor the use of documents, pen, or paper. It was in fact not a trial at all, and a packed bench of judges on Sunday, May 12th, pronounced sentence of death. On the following day, the old statesman, at the age of 71, was beheaded in the Binnenhof at The Hague. Not a shred of evidence has ever been produced to throw suspicion upon the patriot statesman's conduct. All his private papers fell into the hands of his foes, but not even the bitterest and ablest of his personal enemies, Francis Arsens, could extract from them anything to show that Oldenbarnevelt at any time betrayed his country's interests. His high-handed course of action in defense of what he conceived to be the sovereign rights of his own province of Holland to decide upon religious questions within its borders may be challenged on the ground of inexpediency, but not of illegality. The harshness of the treatment meted out by Maurice to his father's old friend, the faithful counselor and protector of his own early years, leaves a stain upon the stadtholder's memory. That the prince should have felt compelled in the last resort to take up arms for the Union against the attempt of the province of Holland to defy the authority of the Generality may be justified by the plea Re publicae salis supprime lex. To eject the advocate from power was one thing, to execute him as a traitor quite another. The condemnation of Oldenbarnevelt was carried out with Maurice's consent and approval, and he cannot be acquitted of a prominent share in what posterity has pronounced to be a judicial murder. Oldenbarnevelt was married in 1575 to Maria van Utrecht. He left 2 sons, the lords of Groeneveld and Stoutenburg, and 2 daughters. A conspiracy against the life of Maurice, in which the sons of Oldenbarnevelt took place, was discovered in 1623. Stoutenburg, who was the chief accomplice, made his escape and entered the service of Spain. Groeneveld was executed. On this day in history, May 14th, 1610, Henry IV of France is assassinated by Catholic zealot François Ravaillac, and Louis XIII ascends the throne. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the assassin. François Ravaillac, born 1578, died 1610. The assassin of Henry IV of France, was born near Angoulême. He began life as a valet de chambre, but afterwards became a lawyer and schoolteacher. He failed to obtain admission either to the recently founded Order of Feuilletons or to the Society of Jesus. Rumors that the king was intending to make war upon the Pope suggested him to the idea of assassination, which he carried out on May 14, 1610. He was executed on May 27, 1610. On this day in history, May 15th, 392, Emperor Valentinian II is assassinated while advancing into Gaul against the Frankish usurper Urbogast. He is found hanging in his residence at Vienne. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Valentinian. Valentinian II, son of Valentinian I, an infant of 4 in 375 with his half-brother Gratian, a lad of about 17, became the emperors of the West. They made Milan their home, and the empire was nominally divided between them, Gratian taking the Transalpine provinces, whilst Italy, Illyricum in part, and Africa were to be under the rule of Valentinian, or rather of his mother, Justina. In 387, Magnus Maximus, who had in 383 overthrown Gratian and made himself master of the northern provinces, crossed the Alps and threatened Milan. The emperor and his mother fled to Theodosius, the emperor of the East. Valentinian was restored in 388 by Theodosius. 4 years later, he was murdered at Vienne in Gaul, probably at the instigation of his Frankish general, Arbogast. On this day in history, May 16th, 1527, the Florentines drive out the Medici for a second time, and Florence reestablishes itself as a republic. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the second expulsion of the Medici. Cardinal Passerini's regency proved most unpopular, and the city was soon seething with discontent. Revolts broke out, and Passerini showed himself quite unequal to the situation. The nobles were mostly anti-Medician, and when Filippo Strozzi, and above all his wife, threw their influence in the scales against the Medici, and the magistrates declared for their expulsion from power, Passerini, Ippolito, and Alessandro left Florence, May 17, 1527. A Consiglio degli Scelti was summoned, and a constitution similar to that of Savonarola's time was established. The Greater Council was revived, and Niccolò Caponi created Gonfaloniere for a year. But Florence was torn by factions. Having been re-elected Gonfaloniere, in spite of much opposition in 1528, Caponi tried to make peace with the Pope. But his correspondence with the Vatican resulted in a quite unjustified charge of high treason, and although acquitted, he had to resign office and leave the city for 6 months. Francesco Carducci was elected Gonfaloniere in his place, and on June 29, 1529, the Pope and the Emperor concluded a treaty by which the latter agreed to re-establish the Medici to Florence. On this day in history, May 17th, 1521, Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham, is executed for treason. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the House of Stafford. This famous English house was founded in England by Robert, a younger brother of Ralph de Toncy, or Tonay, of a noble Norman house, who was standard-bearer of the duchy. Robert received at the conquest a great fief, extending into 7 counties, and became known as Robert de Stafford, from his residence at Stafford Castle. With his son, the male line became extinct, and his sister's husband, Hervey Bagot, one of the knightly tenants, succeeded to the fief in her right, 1194. Their descendant, Edmund de Stafford, that surname having been assumed, was summoned as a baron in 1299. His son, Ralph, conducted the brilliant defense of Ungulus against the host of France, fought at Crécy, and in the siege of Calais, chosen a Knight of the Garter at the foundation of the order. He was created Earl of Stafford in 1351. His son Hugh, who succeeded as 2nd Earl in 1372, served in the French Wars. From 1376 he became prominent in politics, probably through his marriage to a daughter of the Earl of Warwick, being one of the 4 lords on the committee in the Good Parliament, and also serving on the committees that controlled Richard II, 1378 to 80, whom he accompanied on his Scottish expedition in 1385. He died next year on pilgrimage at Rhodes. His son, Thomas, the 3rd Earl, married in 1392 the daughter and heiress of Thomas, Duke of Buckingham, son of Edward III, who, on Thomas's death, married in 1398 his brother Edmund, the 5th Earl. Their son, Humphrey, 1402 to 1460, the first Stafford Duke of Buckingham, was placed by his descent and his possessions in the front rank of the English nobility. Henry, the 2nd Duke, was attainted in 1483, but on the triumph of Henry VII in 1486, Edward, the 3rd Duke, 1478 to 1521, regained the title and estates, and recovered the ancestral office of Lord High Constable in 1509. He was accused of treason, and after a nominal trial by his peers, was beheaded on May 17, 1521, a subsequent act, 1523, confirming his attainder. Henry, 1501 to 1563, the son of the last duke, was granted by the crown some of his father's manors for his support, and, espousing the Protestant cause, though married to a daughter of Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, and sister of Cardinal Pole, was restored in blood on Edward VI's accession, and declared Lord Stafford as a new creation by Act of Parliament. His second surviving son, Thomas, eventually assumed the royal arms, sailed from Dieppe with 2 ships in April 1557, landed at Scarborough, seized the castle, and proclaimed himself protector. He was captured and executed for high treason. His father's new barony, in 1637, passed to a cadet in humble circumstances, who was called on, as a pauper, to surrender it to the king, which he did, illegally, it is now held, in 1639. The king thereupon bestowed it on Mary Stafford, the heir general of the line, and her husband, William Howard, in whose descendants it is now vested. Roger, who had surrendered the title, died in 1640, the last male heir, apparently, of the main line of this historic house. On this day in history, May 18th, 872, Louis II of Italy is crowned for the 2nd time as Holy Roman Emperor at Rome at the age of 47. His first coronation was 28 years earlier, in 844, during the reign of his father, Lothair I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Louis. Louis II, born 1825, died 875, Roman Emperor. Eldest son of the Emperor Lothair I, was designated King of Italy in 839, and was crowned king at Rome by Pope Sergius II on June 15th, 844. In 850 he was crowned joint emperor at Rome by Pope Leo IV, and soon afterwards married his cousin, Engelberga, a daughter of King Louis the German, and undertook the independent government of Italy. On the death of his father, in 855, he became sole emperor. In 857 he allied himself with Louis the German against his brother Lothair, King of Lorraine, and King Charles the Bald, but after he had secured the election of Nicholas I as Pope in 858, he became reconciled with his brother. In 863, on the death of his brother Charles, Louis received the kingdom of Provence. In 864, he quarreled with Pope Nicholas I over his brother's divorce, which the Pope had declared invalid, and in February reached Rome with an army, but made peace with the Pope and left the city. In 866, he routed the Saracens, but could not follow up his successes, owing to the want of a fleet. In 869, with the assistance of his ally, the Eastern Emperor, Basil I, he captured Bari, the headquarters of the Saracens. He had withdrawn into Benevento to prepare for a further campaign, when he was treacherously robbed and imprisoned by Adalchis, Prince of Benevento, in August 871, but was released a month later. Returning to Rome, he was crowned a second time as emperor by Pope Hadrian II on May 18, 872. After further successes against the Saracens, who were driven from Capua, he returned to northern Italy. He died, somewhere in the province of Brescia, on August 12, 875, and was buried in the church of St. Ambrose at Milan, having named as his successor in Italy his cousin Carloman, son of Louis the German. On this day in history, May 19th, 715, Pope Gregory II is elected. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Gregory. Gregory II, Pope from 715 to 731, succeeded Constantine I, whom he accompanied to Constantinople in 710. To spread Christianity in Germany, Gregory gave special encouragement to the mission of St. Boniface, whom he consecrated bishop in 722. He was a staunch adherent of the East Roman Empire, which still exercised sovereignty over Rome, Ravenna, and some other parts of Italy, and he impeded as far as possible the progress of the Lombards. About 726, however, he came into conflict with the Emperor Leo the Isaurian on account of the excessive taxation of the Italians, and later on account of his iconoclastic edicts. Leo endeavored to rid himself of the Pope by violence, but Gregory, supported by the people of Rome and by the Lombards, succeeded in eluding the emperor and died peacefully on February 11th, 731. On this day in history, May 20th, 325, the First Council of Nicaea is formally opened, starting the First Ecumenical Council of the Christian Church. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the council. The Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, is an event of the highest importance in the history of Christianity. Its convocation by Constantine and its course illustrate the radical revolution which the position of this religion within the confines of the Roman Empire had undergone in consequence of the Edict of Milan. From his ascension, Constantine had shown himself the friend of the Christians, and when his victory over Licinius, 323 AD, gave him undisputed possession of the crown, he adhered to this religious policy, distinguishing and fortifying the Christian cause by gratuities and grants of privileges. This propitiatory attitude originated in the fact that he recognized Christianity, which had successfully braved so many persecutions, as the most vital and vigorous of religions, and as the power of the future. Consequently, he directed his energies toward the establishment of a positive relationship between it and the Roman state. But the Church could only maintain its great value for the politician by remaining the same compact organism which it had proved itself to be under the stormy reign of Diocletian. Scarcely, however, did it find itself in the enjoyment of peaceful relations with the state, when violent feuds broke out in its midst, whose extent and the virulence with which they were waged threatened to dismember the whole religious body. Donatism in the West was followed by the Arian struggle in the East. The former movement had been successfully arrested, though it survived in North Africa till the 5th century. The conflict kindled by the Alexandrian presbyter Arius with regard to the relation of Christ to God assumed a more formidable character. Constantine, therefore, had recourse to an institution previously evolved by the Christian Church, the convocation of a synod to pronounce on burning questions, enlarging it, however, to correspond with the altered circumstances. He convened a council designed to represent the whole Church of the Empire at Nicaea in Bithynia, a town situated no great way from the imperial summer residence of Nicomedia, and within easy reach by sea of the Oriental bishops. In consequence of the vast distances, the West was not largely represented, but the able theologian Hosius, Bishop of Cordova, was present. The three most important bishoprics of the East were represented: Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. A prominent part was also taken by Eusebius, Bishop of Nicaea, and his namesake of Caesarea, the historian, along with a very large number of others from the East. Among the attendant clergy, the still youthful deacon Athanasius, destined to succeed Alexander in the See of Alexandria, was prominent as the most powerful antagonist of Arianism. The synod sat from May 20th to July 25th. The deliberations on the Arian question passed through several distinct stages before the final condemnation of Arius and his doctrines was reached. A clearly defined standpoint was repealed to this. With regard to this problem, the relationship of Christ to God was held only by the comparatively small group of Arians and a not much larger group who adhered with unshaken conviction to the Alexandrian view. The bulk of the members occupied a position between these two extremes. They rejected the formula of Arius and declined to accept those of his opponents. That is to say, they were merely competent to establish negotiations, but lacked the capacity as yet to give their attitude of compromise a positive expression. That the majority of the council should have adopted this neutral tendency is easily intelligible when we consider the state of theology at that period. True, at Nicaea, this majority eventually acquiesced in the ruling of the Alexandrians, yet this result was due, not to internal conviction, but partly to indifference, partly to the pressure of the imperial will, a fact which is mainly demonstrated by the subsequent history of the Arian conflicts. For if the Nicene Synod had arrived at its final decision by the consensus agreement of all non-Arians, then the confession of faith there formulated might indeed have evoked this continued antagonism of the Arians, but must necessarily have been championed by all else. This, however, was not the case. In fact, the creed was assailed by those very bodies which had posed the laissez-faire center at Nicaea, and we are compelled to the conclusion that, in this point, the voting was no criterion of the inward convictions of the council. In the synod, an Arian confession of faith was first brought forward and read, but it aroused such a storm of indignation that obviously, in the interests of a restoration of ecclesiastical peace, there could be no question of its acceptance. On this, Eusebius of Caesarea submitted the baptismal creed of his community. Since the creed dated from a period anterior to the outbreak of the Arian struggle, its reception would have been equivalent to a declaration on the part of the council that it declined to define its position with reference to the controversy of the hour. That the greater number of delegates were not disinclined to adopt this subterfuge, and to shelve the actual solution of the whole problems by recognition of this or some similar neutral formula, is extremely probable. But the emperor saw that, if the difficulties were eluded in any such way, it was inevitable from the very nature of the case that they should rise again in an accentuated form, and that consequently no pacification could be expected from this policy. Accordingly, Constantine proposed that the Caesarean Creed should be modified by the insertion of the Alexandrian passwords, including the decisive term identical in nature, as if for the purpose of more accurate definition, and by the deletion of certain portions. That he appreciated the import of these alterations, or realized that this revision was virtually the proclamation of a new doctrine, is scarcely probable. The creed thus evolved by an artificial unity with no ratification of peace. In fact, it paved the way for a struggle which convulsed the whole empire. For it was the proclamation of the Nicene Creed that first opened the eyes of many bishops to the significance of the problem there treated, and its explanation led the Church to force herself, by an arduous path of theological work, into compliance with those principles enunciated at Nicaea, to which in the year 325 she had pledged herself without genuine assent. On this day in history, May 21st, 293, Roman Emperors Diocletian and Maximian appoint Galerius as Caesar to Diocletian, beginning the period of 4 rulers known as the Tetrarchy. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Caesar. Galerius, or Galerius Valerius Maximinius, Roman Emperor from 305 AD to 311, was born near Sardica in Thrace. He served with distinction as a soldier under Aurelian and Probus, and in 293 was designated Caesar along with Constantius Chlorus. In 305, on the abdication of Diocletian and Maximinius, he at once assumed the title of Augustus, with Constantius his former colleague. And having procured the promotion to the rank of Caesar of Flavius Valerius Severus, a faithful servant, and Dia, Maximinus, his nephew, he hoped on the death of Constantius to become sole ruler of the Roman world. This scheme, however, was defeated by the sudden elevation of Constantine at Eboracum, York, on the death of his father, and by the action of Maximinius and Maxentius in Italy. In 307 he elevated his friend Licinius to the rank of Augustus, and devoted the remaining years of his life to the enjoyment of pleasure and to the execution of some works of public utility. It was at his instance that the first of the celebrated edicts of persecution against the Christians was published on February 24, 303, and his policy of repression was maintained by him until the appearance of the General Edict of Toleration, 311, issued in his own name and in those of Licinius and Constantine. He died May 311. On this day in history, May 22nd, 853, a Byzantine fleet sacks and destroys undefended Damietta in Egypt. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Damietta, a town of Lower Egypt on the eastern Damietta or Phatnatic branch of the Nile, a few miles above its mouth and 125 miles north by northeast of Cairo by rail. Population, from 1937, 40,332. The town is built on the east bank of the river between it and Lake Menzala. Though ill-built and partly ruinous, the town possesses some fine mosques with lofty minarets, public baths, and busy bazaars. Along the riverfront are many substantial houses with terraces and steps leading to the water. Their wooden lattices of sawwork are very graceful. Once the third town in Egypt, it enjoys now little more than a coasting trade, and ships of over 6 feet draught must anchor in the offing. Damietta is a Levantine corruption of the Coptic name Tamiati, Arabic Dumiat. The original town was 4 miles nearer to the sea than the modern city. Under the Saracens, it had great wealth and commerce, and, as the eastern bulwark of Egypt, was frequently attacked by the Crusaders. In June 1249, Louis IX of France occupied Damietta without opposition, but being defeated near Mansoura in the February following, and compelled, April 6th, to surrender himself prisoner, Damietta was restored to the Muslims as part of the ransom exacted. To prevent further attacks from the sea, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars blocked up the Phatnitic mouth of the Nile, about 1260. Razed old Damietta to the ground, and transferred the inhabitants to the site of the modern town. Damietta gives its name to dimity, a kind of striped cloth, for which the place was at one time famous. Cotton and silk goods are still manufactured here, and there is some trade in rice and salted fish. On this day in history, May 23rd, 1430, Joan of Arc is captured at the siege of Compiègne by troops from the Burgundian faction. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Compiègne, a town of northern France, capital of an arrondissement, department of Oise, 52 miles north by northeast of Paris, famous for chateau, park, and forest. Population, from 1936, 17,929. The town, which is a favorite summer resort, stands on the northwest border of the forest of Compiègne and on the left bank of the Oise, near its confluence with the Aisne. The river is crossed by a bridge built in the reign of Louis XV. Compiègne, or Compendium, seems originally to have been a hunting lodge of the early Frankish kings. It was enriched by Charles the Bald with 2 castles and a Benedictine abbey dedicated to Saint Corneille, the monks of which retained down to the 18th century the privilege of acting for 3 days as lords of Compiègne, with full judicial privileges. It was in Compiègne that King Louis I, the Dominaire, was deposed in 833, and at the siege of the town in 1430 Joan of Arc was taken prisoner by the English. A monument to her faces the Hôtel de Ville. The Treaty of Compiègne, between Richelieu and the Dutch, was signed there in 1624. In 1814, Compiègne offered a stubborn resistance to the Prussian troops. Under Napoleon III, it was the annual resort of the court during the hunting season. From 1870 to 1871, it was one of the headquarters of the German army. The town was occupied by the Germans in 1914 and was bombarded in 1918. The armistice of November 11, 1918 was signed there in a dining car. During World War II, the Germans again occupied the town in June 1940. The Franco-German armistice of June 22, 1940 was signed in the same dining car at Compiègne. Later, the Germans moved the car to Berlin. The Hôtel de Ville, with a graceful facade surmounted by a lofty belfry, is late Gothic, early 16th century. Of the churches, St. Antoine, 13th century and 16th century, has some fine Renaissance stained glass, and St. Jacques dates from the 13th and 15th centuries. There are remains of the ancient abbey of St. Corneille. Compiègne, from a very early period until 1870, was the occasional residence of the French kings. Its magnificent palace, chateau, now an art museum, was erected chiefly by Louis XV and restored by Napoleon I. It has 2 facades, one overlooking the town, the other facing a fine park and a forest, 55 square miles. Compiègne is the seat of a sub-prefect, and has tribunals of first instance and of commerce. Industries are boat building, rope making, cooperage, and copper and iron founding. Asparagus is cultivated in the environs. There is river-borne trade in timber and coal. Telephone, accessories, parachutes, etc. are manufactured. On this day in history, May 24th, 919, the nobles of Franconia and Saxony elect Henry the Fowler at the imperial diet in Fritzlar as king of the East Frankish kingdom. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Henry. Henry I, born around 876, died 936, surnamed the Fowler, German king, son of Otto the Illustrious, Duke of Saxony, shared in early life in various campaigns for the defense of Saxony. He married Hatburg, a daughter of Erwin, Count of Merseburg, but as she had taken the veil on the death of her former husband, this union was declared illegal by the Church, and in 909 he married Matilda, daughter of a Saxon count named Theodoric, and a reputed descendant of the hero Widukind. On his father's death in 912, he became Duke of Saxony, which he defended against the Slavs. In 918, the German king Conrad I advised the nobles to make the Saxon duke his successor. The Franks and the Saxons met at Fritzlar in May 919 and chose Henry as German king. The new king refused to allow his election to be sanctioned by the Church. His authority, save in Saxony, was merely nominal, but he secured a recognition of his sovereignty from the Bavarians and the Swabians. In 921, Charles III of France recognized Henry as the king of the East Franks, and when in 923 the French king was taken prisoner by Herbert, Count of Vermandois, Lorraine came under Henry's authority, and Giselbert, who married his daughter Gerberga, was recognized as duke. Henry reduced various Slavonic tribes in the east to subjection, took Bernabor, the modern Brandenburg, from the Helveli, and secured both banks of the Elbe for Saxony. In 923 he had bought a truce for 10 years with the Hungarians by a promise of tribute, and on its expiration he gained 2 great victories over them in 933 at Checkaberg and Reide. The Danes were defeated, and territory as far as the Eder secured for Germany, and the king sought further to extend his influence by entering into relations with the kings of England, France, and Burgundy. He died at Memleben on July 2, 936. By his first wife, Hatburg, he left a son, Thankmar, who was excluded from the succession as illegitimate, and by Matilda he left 3 sons, the eldest of whom, Otto, afterwards the Emperor Otto the Great, succeeded him, and 2 daughters. Henry undertook only such enterprises as he was able to carry through. Laying more stress on his position as Duke of Saxony than King of Germany, he conferred great benefits on his duchy. The founder of her town life and the creator of her army, he ruled in harmony with her nobles and secured her frontiers from attack. On this day in history, May 25th, 1085, Alfonso VI of Castile takes Toledo, Spain, back from the Moors, including the following. It's an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the capital. Toledo, the capital of the Spanish province of Toledo, and formerly of the whole country. 47 miles by rail south-southwest of Madrid on the river Tagus, 24 feet above sea level. Population from 1940, 25,503. Toledo is of immemorial antiquity. It was a stronghold of the Carpetani and may have been a Carthaginian trading station. Livy mentions Toletum as Urbis Parva sed loco monita, which was captured by the Romans in 193 BC. Under Roman rule, it became a colonia and the capital of Carpetania. Its ecclesiastical importance is coeval with the introduction of Christianity into Spain. There were numerous church councils held here, notably in 396, 400, and 589. And here also was the chief battleground in the long political and religious struggle which ended, 589, in the triumph of the Spanish Catholicism over Arianism. From the reign of Athanagild, 534 to 547, until the Moorish conquest in 712, Toletum was generally regarded as the capital of Visigothic Spain. The Moorish chroniclers grow eloquent over the treasures captured by Musa and his army in 712. Tola y Tola, as the city was then called, prospered under the Moors, first as a provincial capital in the Caliphate of Cordova, governed by an emir, 712 to 1035, afterwards as an independent state, 1035 to 85. Its rulers protected the large Jewish colony, founded extensive silk and woolen industries, and made their city an important center of Arab and Hebrew culture, one of the great names associated with it being that of Rabbi Ben Ezra, 1119 to 74. Spanish and Jewish inhabitants became Mozarabs, adopting much of the Moorish culture. Toledo was captured by Alfonso of Leon and Castile, aided by the Cid, in 1085, and 2 years later, he made it his capital. It declined after Philip II moved the capital to Madrid, 1560. In one of the most famous sieges of the Civil War of 1936-39, nationalists in the Toledo Alcazar held out for 70 days and were relieved on September 27, 1936. Toledo occupies a rugged promontory of granite, washed on all sides, except the north by the Tagus, which here flows swiftly through a deep and precipitous gorge. From a distance, it has the aspect of a vast fortress, built on granite, defended by the river and by a double wall on the north, and dominated by the towers of its cathedral and alcazar. The absence of traffic in its maze of dark and winding alleys creates a silence uncommon in so large a town. The principal plaza is the arcaded Zocodover, described by Cervantes in the Novelas Ejemplares. The houses, tall, massive, and somber, are entered by huge iron-studded doors, and most of their windows open on a sheltered inner court, patio. The Alcazar and many other buildings of Toledo suffered great damage during the siege of 1936. The Tagus is spanned by 2 fortified Moorish bridges, the Puente de Alcantara on the northeast, which was rebuilt in the 13th and 17th centuries, and the Puente de San Martin on the northwest, founded in 1212 and rebuilt in 1390. The Mudahar Puerta del Sol is the finest of several ancient gateways, among which the Puerta Visagra, 1550, restored 1575, and the Puerto de Cambron, 1102, restored 1576, are also interesting. The Puerto Visagra Antigua, a Moorish gateway of the 9th century, has been walled up, but its original form is preserved. The Alcazar, a huge square building with a tower at each corner and a fine arcaded patio, stands on the highest ground in Toledo, originally the site of a Roman fort and now a military academy. Its fine facade, designed by Juan de Herrera, a gateway by Alonso de Covarrubias, and a staircase by Herrera and Francisco de Villalpando have been preserved. The Ayuntamiento, or City Hall, is a 15th century building with 17th century alterations by Domenico Theotocopuli, El Greco. The cathedral occupies the site of a Visigothic church. St. Ferdinand founded the present cathedral in August 1227. The completion of the main fabric was delayed until 1493, while many of the chapels and other subordinate buildings were added even later. Thus, Renaissance and Baroque features have been introduced into a design which was originally Gothic of the 13th century. The interior is 395 feet long by 178 feet broad and is divided by 84 pillars into 5 naves, with central lantern and choir, and a complete series of side chapels. Most of the chapels date from the 15th and 16th centuries and are very magnificent in detail. The superb stained glass windows, chiefly of Flemish work, belong to the same period and number 750. The choir stalls, placed in alabaster recesses divided by columns of red jasper and white marble, are among the finest extant examples of late medieval and Renaissance wood carving, though rivaled by the retablo, which rises behind the high altar to the roof. The treasury, reliquaries, and library still contain many priceless masterpieces and works of art, including the silver monstrance executed by Enrique de Arfe in 1524, and the paintings of Goya, El Greco, Titian, and Rubens. In the Mozarabic chapel, Mass is still performed daily, according to the Mozarabic liturgy, which was also used in 6 of the parish churches until about 1850. Apart from the cathedral, many of the other churches are of great interest and beauty. Several of them, notably Santo Tome and San Vicente, contain masterpieces of El Greco, died 1614, many of whose pictures are collected in the Casa del Greco, founded by the Marqués de Vega Inclán. The Franciscan convent and church of San Juan de los Reyes, florid Gothic, were founded in 1476 by Ferdinand and Isabella. El Cristo de la Luz was originally a mosque, built in 922, and incorporating some pillars from an older Visigothic church. Santo Tome, also a mosque, was reconstructed in the Gothic style during the 14th century. El Cristo de la Vega, formerly known as the Basilica de Santa Leocadia, occupies the site of a Visigothic church built in the 4th century to mark the burial place of the saint. The Mudéjar Santa Maria la Blanca becomes successfully a synagogue. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a church, 1405, an asylum for women, 1550, barracks, 1791-98, and again a church. Toledo's characteristic industry is the manufacture of swords carried on by private firms, and especially in the Royal Factory, 1788, which, like the railway station, is about 1 mile from the city. Toledan blades have been famous for 2,000 years, the Coulter Talatanus being mentioned in the Synagetica of Gradius Faliscus. During the 1st century BC, the industry throve under the Moors, and especially during the 16th century. It is now practiced on a smaller scale, but the blades produced are still remarkable for flexibility and strength. On this day in history, May 26th, 1864, Montana is organized as a United States territory. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the state. That part of Montana, lying east of the Continental Divide, became a part of the United States with the purchase of Louisiana from France in 1803. The smaller region west of the Divide belonged to the Oregon Country, which was held jointly by the United States and Great Britain until the treaty in 1846 gave the United States sole title south of the 49th degree of latitude. Montana may have been seen by white men as early as 1742, depending on whether the high, well-wooded mountains reached by the expedition under Pierre and Chevalier de la Vérendrye, French traders from Canada, were the Bighorn Range, the Laramie Range, or the Black Hills. The next expedition was by the Lewis and Clark expedition, which reached the eastern borders of the state in April 1805. They ascended the Missouri to the confluence of the 3 streams that form it, which they named the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers. Ascending the Jefferson, they crossed the divide to the Bitterroot Valley, which they descended until Lolo Pass gave them an opportunity to go beyond the Bitterroot Range into Idaho. On the return, they re-entered Montana by the same pass and then divided their party. Lewis led one division up the Big Blackfoot River and crossed by Lewis and Clark Pass to the Missouri near Great Falls. Clark, with the other division, ascended the Bitterroot and, crossing the headwaters of the Missouri, reached the Yellowstone, which he was the first to explore. The parties met again at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri. The reports of this expedition stimulated the Missouri fur traders to extend their operations into the region. Manuel Lisa, in 1807, built a trading post on the Yellowstone at the mouth of the Bighorn River, the first building in Montana. The same year, one of his men, John Coulter, losing the trail in the upper Yellowstone country, discovered the future Yellowstone Park. After 1807, Lisa's traders made annual trips into the region. West of the Divide, David Thompson, of the Northwest Company, explored the Coutances River in 1808. The same autumn, he sent Finan MacDonald to build a trading house at Coutances Falls, the first building on the western slopes of the state. Thompson himself built Salish House, a more permanent post, on Clark's Fork the following year. For the next half-century, the fur trade dominated the region. That on the eastern slope was soon monopolized by the American Fur Company. Kenneth Mackenzie was put in charge of the Upper Missouri outfit of this company in 1827, and from Fort Union, which he built in 1829 near the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, he ruled the traders and Indians of the vast territory. The trade west of the Divide was controlled by British interests. Iroquois Indians, employed by the fur companies to teach the mountain Indians to hunt for furs, taught them also the Catholic religion. The Salish Indians sent 4 separate delegations to St. Louis to bring back the black robes, and Father P.J. de Smet returned with the last of these in 1840. In 1841, he founded St. Mary's Mission in the Bitterroot Valley. A number of settlers trickled into the Bitterroot Valley between 1850 and 1860, but the real rush of immigration came only when gold was discovered. The first strike was made in 1858 on Gold Creek by James and Granville Stewart, and in 1861 and 1862 a little colony of pioneers was panning the sands of the stream. The later years saw a richer strike made on Grasshopper Creek in the Beaverhead country, where Bannock sprang up, the liveliest town in the region in 1863. Also in 1863, gold was discovered in Alder Gulch, one of the richest placer areas the world has known, where Virginia City grew up and soon outdistanced all its rivals. At Virginia City in 1864, the first newspaper, the Montana Post, appeared. The same year, Last Chance Gulch, the site of the future capital city of Helena, was discovered. And finally, in that year, Montana was organized as a separate territory. Sidney Edgerton was appointed its first governor, and the first legislature met at Bannock. New placer discoveries were constantly made during the next few decades of Montana's history, until there were camps in hundreds of gulches. By 1876, the gold to the value of $144,400,000 was produced. Metalliferous quartz was discovered at Helena, Phillipsburg, and Butte, at the last 2 places containing silver veins. The Phillipsburg district was especially prosperous until the decline of silver values forced many of the mines to close. Not until the early 80s was the copper discovery made at Butte, which was to result in the place becoming one of the world's greatest mining camps. The large influx of miners brought difficulties with the Indians. It had been to the interest of the fur traders and the missionaries to keep peace with and among the various tribes, but no such mutual benefit relations existed between the Indians and the gold hunters. The Sioux and Cheyenne united in trying to prevent immigrants from passing over the Bozeman Trail, and this important shortcut to Montana from the Plate had to be closed by the government. The Sioux were again on the warpath in 1876 because the miners had invaded their Black Hills Reserve, and that year they annihilated General Custer's 5 companies of cavalry on the Little Bighorn River. So many of the Indians were killed, however, that their power was broken. The government began to make treaties with the different tribes, in which the boundaries of the Indian country were carefully defined. The Indians were ordered to stay on these reservations. The last disturbance came in 1877 when Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce refused to stay on the reservation and attempted to escape with his followers into Canada. After giving desperate battle in the Big Hole country and conducting a masterly retreat over more than 1,000 miles, he was surrounded in the Big Paw Mountains and was forced to surrender to General Miles. During all these years, the eastern 3/5 of the state was unsettled, and settlement came only when agriculture and the livestock industry began to expand eastward. The first stock and the first crops were raised near the mines and sold to the mining camps. Prices were high, and disappointed miners found the production of food a lucrative business. The first drive of cattle from Texas to Montana was made in 1869. The first rail shipments were trailed from western Montana to the Union Pacific at Ogden, Utah. After the Indians were quieted in 1877, most of the shipments were driven to Cheyenne, Wyoming. The completion of the Northern Pacific Railway through the state, 1879 to 83, immensely stimulated the cattle industry. In 1885, 79,089 head were shipped to market. In 1891, 250,000 head, and from then to 1912, the shipments amounted to more than 200,000 head annually. Sheep raising was developed in Montana even before the cattle industry because it was not so dependent upon transportation. Large quantities of wool were shipped by flatboat down the Missouri and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans and thence by steamer to Boston. Sheep increased from 4,212 in 1870 to 249,978 by 1880, to 1,999,000 in 1890, and to 6,170,000 in 1900, when the wool clip of Montana exceeded that of any other state. In the first decade of the present century, the encroachment of the homesteaders began to be felt by the stockmen, many of whom sold out as agricultural development increased land values. Before 1890, the comparatively little farming was subsidiary to the livestock industry. Farming was developed first in the Bitterroot and Gallatin valleys. By 1880, it showed a tendency to creep eastward into the Judith Basin and down the Yellowstone. Oats were the chief crop, the stage lines and military posts affording a home market for it. The construction of the Northern Pacific extended the area of rural settlement eastward along the Yellowstone as far as Glendive. Wheat could now be raised for shipment. Farms increased from 1,519 in 1880 to 5,603 in 1890 and to 13,370 in 1900, when there were 1,736,701 acres of improved land. Over one half of this acreage was irrigated, while in 1935 only 2.7% of the 47,511,868 acres of improved land were irrigated. This shows the tremendous influx of dry land homesteaders in recent decades. In 1900, little farming was done in eastern Montana except in the Yellowstone and Milk River valleys, but by 1910 the benchlands back on the river valleys were being settled, and between 1910 and 1920 every eastern county in the state, except Cascade, showed an increase in rural population of 50% or over. From the beginning of statehood, 1889, Montana had only 3 Republican governors: Richards, 1893 to 97, Dixon, 1921 to 25, and Ford, 1941 to present. In presidential elections, the state has fluctuated, 6 times Republican and 7 times Democratic. On this day in history, May 27th, 1863, as part of the American Civil War, the first Union infantry assault of the siege of Port Hudson occurs. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Port Hudson. Port Hudson, a village in East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana, USA, on the left bank of the Mississippi, about 135 miles above New Orleans. At the sharp turn of the Mississippi here, the Confederates in 1862 built on the commanding bluffs powerful batteries covering a stretch of about 3 miles, their strongest fortifications along the Mississippi between New Orleans and Vicksburg. On the night of March 14, 1863, Admiral Farragut with 7 vessels attempted to run past the batteries commanded by Brigadier General William M. Gardner, but 4 of his vessels were disabled and forced to turn back. 1, the Mississippi, was destroyed, and only 2, the Hartford and the Albatross, got past. General M.P. Banks's land attack on May 27th was unsuccessful, the Union loss, nearly 2,000, being 6 times that of the Confederates. A second attack on June 14th entailed a further Union loss of about 1,800 men. But on July 9th, 2 days after the news of the surrender of Vicksburg, after a siege of 45 days, General Gardner surrendered the position to General Banks with about 6,400 men, 50 guns, 5,000 small arms and ammunition, and 2 river steamers. The Union losses during the siege were probably more than 4,000, the Confederate losses about 800. The capture of Vicksburg and Port Hudson secured to the Union the control of the Mississippi. On this day in history, May 28, 1644, as part of the English Civil War, the Bolton Massacre by Royalist troops under the command of James Stanley, 7th Earl of Derby, occurs. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Bolton, or Bolton-le-Moors, municipal, county, and parliamentary borough, Lancashire, England, 11 miles northwest of Manchester, population of 1891, 146,487, population of 1938, 169,400, areas 23.9 square miles. It is served by the LMS Railway and divided by the Crowle, a small tributary of the Irwell, into Great and Little Bolton, while, as the name implies, it is surrounded by high moorland. Although of early origin, its appearance, like that of many great manufacturing towns of the vicinity, is wholly modern. The earliest forms of the name is Boldleton or Bothleton. The manor was granted by William I to Roger de Puctu, and passed through the families of Ferrers and Pilkington to the Harringtons of Hornby Castle, who lost it with their other estates for their adherence to Richard III. In 1485, Henry VII granted it to the first Earl of Derby. The manor of Little Bolton seems to have been, at least from Henry III's reign, distinct from that of Great Bolton, and was held till the 17th century by the Bothletons, or Boltons. The site of the Church of St. Peter has long been occupied by a parish church. There was one there in the 12th century, but the existing building only dates from 1870. In 1251, William de Ferrers obtained from the crown a charter for a weekly market and a yearly fair, but gradually this annual fair was replaced by 4 others chiefly for horses and cattle. The New Year and Whitsuntide Show fairs arose only during the 19th century. During the Civil War, Bolton sided with the Parliament, and in 1643 and 1644 the Royalist forces assaulted the town. In the early days, Bolton was famous for its woolen manufactures. In Richard I's reign, an almoner, whose duty it was to measure and stamp all bundles of woolen goods, was appointed. The industry flourished so greatly that when, in 1566, deputies were appointed to assist the almoners, Bolton is again named. Leland, in his itinerary, 1558, recorded the fact that Bolton made cottons, which were in reality woolen goods. Real cotton goods were not made in Lancashire till 1641, when Bolton is named as the chief seat of the manufacture of fustians, vermilions, and dimities. Velvets were first made here about 1756 by Jeremiah Clark, and muslins and cotton quiltings in 1763. The inventors of spinning machinery, Arkwright and Crompton, were both born in the parish. Spinning factories were erected, the first in Bolton, about 1780. In 1851, there were 66 cotton mills with 860,000 throstle spindles at work. The cognate industry of bleaching has been carried on since early in the 18th century, and large ironworks grew up in the latter half of the 19th century. In 1791, a canal was constructed from Manchester to Bolton, and by an Act of Parliament, 1792, Bolton Moor was enclosed. On this day in history, May 29th, 1176, at the Battle of Legnano, the Lombard League defeats Emperor Friedrich I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Legnano, a town of Lombardy, Italy, province of Milan, 17 miles northwest of it by rail, 682 feet above sea level. Population from 1936, 31,959. The Church of St. Magno, built in the style of Vermont by Lampognano, 1504 to 1529, contains an altarpiece by Luini. There are also remains of a castle of the Visconti. Legnano is the seat of an important cotton, especially cotton finishing, and silk industries, with machine shops, boiler works, and dyeing. Close by, the Lombard League defeated Frederick Barbarossa in 1176. A monument to commemorate the battle was erected on the field in 1876. Another by Buti, erected in 1900, is in the Piazza Federico Barbarossa. The battle is of significance in military history as foreshadowing the end of the great era of cavalry supremacy. Friedrich, in the spring of 1176, sending for reinforcements from South Germany, planned a determined effort to crush the League of the Guelph cities. With a small body of knights, he marched to Como to meet these reinforcements and then sought to regain his headquarters at Pavia by a circuit road, the enemy stronghold of Milan. Meanwhile, however, the Milanese had rallied to them large contingents of their allies and, quitting Milan, placed themselves astride Friedrich's route. He attacked at once, despite his inferiority of numbers, and his cavalry scattered the Lombard cavalry, then pressing on to attack the infantry mass, which lay in the rear. But their charge was brought to a standstill by the close-knit ranks of the Milanese pikemen. Their resistance allowed their own cavalry to rally, and these, reinforced by the arrival of a fresh body from Brescia, charged the flank of Friedrich's cavalry. Friedrich himself was unhorsed, and his troops thereupon broke and fled. The small body of infantry, furnished by the citizen militia of Como, were slaughtered or captured without difficulty. Friedrich, however, managed to escape and reach Pavia. On the Lombard side, the battle had given an illustration of the possibilities of a staunch infantry body as a stable pivot to the mobile arm. On this day in history, May 30th, 70 AD, during the siege of Jerusalem, Titus and his Roman legions breached the second wall of Jerusalem. Jewish defenders retreat to the first wall. The Romans build a circumvallation, cutting down all trees within 15 kilometers, or 9.3 miles. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over Jerusalem during the times of Titus and Hadrian. The Romans would not allow the work to continue, and when Titus besieged Jerusalem in 70, the wall was not complete. Titus, attacking from the north, captured successively the third and second walls, Antonia, the temple, and the upper city. It is probable that his orders for the complete destruction of the temple and fortifications, with the exception of the 3 towers, were not carried out. The Roman garrison which he left remained at Jerusalem until the Jewish War of Freedom under Bar Kokhba in 132. Following the defeat of the Jews, Jerusalem was devastated more completely than by Titus. The site was plowed over and a new city, Aelia Capitolina, so called in honor of Aelius Hadrianus, was built over the ruins. From this, Jews were excluded. But Christians, who had not sided with the Jews, might enter. Temples were dedicated to Bacchus, Venus, and Serapis, and over the former sanctuary a shrine of Jupiter Capitolinus was reared. A boar, the symbol of the 10th Legion, was placed over the southern gate. Other buildings now constructed were the theatre, the Demosia, the Tetranymphon, the Dodecapelon, and the Kodra. For 2 centuries, little is known of Jerusalem. In 326, Constantine ordered Bishop Macarius to recover the sites of the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. 2 great churches were built, one of which, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, stood where its present namesake stands. Of the Basilica of the Cross, no trace remains. In 460, the Empress Eudocia repaired the walls and extended them so as to include Siloam, building also churches. Of these, one, above the Siloam pool, was recovered by F.J. Bliss. Another, over the reputed tomb of Stephen, north of the Damascus Gate, was recovered in 1874. Justinian's Basilica, with adjacent hospitals for the sick and for pilgrims, built in the 6th century, is described by Procopius. This building probably occupied the so-called Tomb of David. In 614, Khosrow II of Persia captured Jerusalem and damaged many buildings, including the Church of the Sepulchre. Heraclius defeated Khosrow and re-entered Jerusalem in 629. In 637, Omar ousted the Romans, but was careful not to harm the city. He built a wooden mosque, which the Caliph Abdul Malik rebuilt in 688. The mosque is El Aqsa. Abdul Malik also constructed the Dome of the Rock, Kubet es-Sakar, or Mosque of Omar. In 1099, the Crusaders under Godfrey of Bouillon entered Jerusalem, and a terrible carnage ensued. Jerusalem became the capital of the Latin kingdom. until Saladin reconquered it in 1187 and repaired the walls. Soon after 1167, Benjamin of Tudela visited Jerusalem and left a description of the city in his itinerary. Excepting from 1229 to 39 and 1243 to 44, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands until its capture, 1917, by Allenby. In 1517, Salim I of Turkey took Jerusalem from the Egyptians. The present configuration of the walls is due to him. As a result of the World War, Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine, a mandated territory of the British Empire. On this day in history, May 31st, 455, Emperor Petronius Maximus is stoned to death by an angry mob while fleeing Rome. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the emperor. Petronius Maximus, a member of the higher Roman nobility, had held several court and public offices. He was one of the intimate associates of Valentinian III, but an outrage committed on the wife of Maximus by the emperor turned his friendship into hatred. Maximus was proclaimed emperor immediately after Valentinian's murder, March 16, 455, but after reigning less than 3 months, he was murdered by some Burgundian mercenaries as he was fleeing before the troops of Gaiseric, who had landed at the mouth of the Tiber, May or June, 455.